Good evening. Welcome to the second installment of URI's Long Road to the Vote, Suffrage Centennial Lecture Series. Please share this lecture and the link, and also consider purchasing the book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All by historian Martha Jones. You can find the link in our comments section. We will get started in just a moment with Professor Jones's talk. For now, please enjoy learning about the College of Arts and Sciences, one of our major sponsors of tonight's talk.
Nobody is going to ever replace the capacity of a human. And this is why thinking is our number one obsession.
What's great about URI, especially in arts and sciences, we're a liberal arts college within a bigger school. And so you get that liberal arts feel, but you also get the ability to do research. We, as the flagship school of our state, do cutting edge work.
You have to really look at schools as a place to grow as yourself. You're not going to be handheld anymore. This is a time for you to really delve into yourself and find what you like. It needs to be somewhere that you're going to find to be a home, but also a place to build yourself. And I think that URI does a great job of that.
Students learn when they engage and get their own hands in that material. You're going to construct knowledge. You're going to do research. That's what creates transformative experiences. That's what creates people who are passionate about learning.
Rather than simply acquiring a body of knowledge, they themselves are developing in a way that keeps them agile, constantly able to re-educate themselves, constantly able to think critically, to adapt to new ways of learning, new ways of thinking, and to keep evolving throughout the course of a life.
Undergraduate liberal arts education is so transformative to the mind, to who you are.
The humanities and the arts are there to help you explore the fringes of what's possible, and understanding how you can look at the world in new and different ways and be ready whenever changes happen.
Multiculturalism and multidisciplinarity are very important because it gives you a unique perspective. You see students are actually excited to see people that think about problems from a different perspective. Problem solving can be attacked from different point of view.
It's nice to be able to come to a school where there's like so many different narratives, so many different perspectives. There's a place for everybody.
I think really what URI has to offer is the people and the opportunities. The people around you, they're all going to help you grow in ways that you've never understood before.
I think there's a lot of people, students in particular, that are just excited that whatever field they're in, they want to be the best at it. There's a sense of pride in the work that you put out there, and I think that's kind of infectious.
A College of Arts and Sciences education gives you the confidence to bring together all the strands that you value and apply them in ways that are fulfilling for you as an individual, but also resonate out.
The thing that sets URI apart is that we as a faculty and as an institution ask our students not just what you can do, but who can you be?
We're a small place, there's no denying that. I kind of think we're like a best kept secret.
Good evening. Welcome to the second installment of URI's Long Road to the Vote, Suffrage Centennial Lecture Series. My name is Katie McIntyre. I'm an assistant professor of gender and women's studies. I'm also the associate director of URI's honors program. I would like to thank the sponsors of tonight's lecture. Thank you to the College of Arts and Sciences, the Center for Humanities, Women's Leadership Council, the Honors Program, Suffrage Centennial Committee, and the Campus Bookstore. If you haven't done so already, please consider purchasing a copy of Martha Jones's book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. You may purchase it at URI's bookstore in person during business hours or online. We have a link right in our comment section on social media, and you will get an autographed copy of a book plate insert of your book if you purchase it through URI. So please get a copy. And finally, I would especially like to thank my home department, Gender and Women's Studies. Through the generosity of the Eleanor Carlson Endowment Fund, Gender and Women's Studies is able to bring such programming as Martha Jones's talk tonight on the history of Black women's suffrage. Eleanor Carlson was a longtime employee at URI. She was one of the earliest and strongest supporters of women's studies programming on our campus and in the greater Rhode Island community. So thank you to the Eleanor Carlson Endowment in Women's Studies. Now, I would like to invite our provost, Dr. Donald DeHaze, to say a few words before we move on to introducing our speaker tonight. Provost DeHaze.
Thank you, Professor McIntyre, and welcome to all the guests this evening to the annual Eleanor Carlson Lecture on Gender and Women's Studies. I'm pleased to be among the first, perhaps publicly, to actually recognize the new Department of Gender and Women's Studies, which we expect will be approved by our Board of Trustees next week. I also want to acknowledge with gratitude the co-sponsorship of the Center for the Humanities under the leadership of Professor Stern, and also my colleagues in the College of Arts and Sciences. Mostly, I want to welcome and thank Dr. Martha Jones for joining us on this virtual event and evening as the keynote presenter on the critically important and timely topic of race and suffrage. Many of us, perhaps too many of us, take for granted our right and our responsibility to vote and may not understand the battles fought, the obstacles that were overcome, and the many decades of disenfranchise that preceded making that right a reality. We find ourselves today in 2020 with the recent passing of John Lewis, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted the women the right to vote, and the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which at least theoretically granted African American men the right to vote, even though most Black men and women were effectively barred from voting until the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And of course, we find ourselves today, literally today, in a highly polarized presidential election year where voting is already abundantly underway and threats to those hard-fought voting rights may be challenged through efforts of voter suppression, voter intimidation, claims of fraud, gerrymandering, and more. This is indeed a time when we must understand the historical perspectives related to women's suffrage and civil rights that form, frankly, the underpinnings of our democracy. And we must insist on voting equality for all and the assurance that each of our votes can be cast, will be cast, and will be legitimately counted, regardless of who we are and what we stand for. Finally, during this troubling time of a global health pandemic, enormous financial insecurity for many, racial injustice playing out before our eyes on an almost daily basis, and deep polarization in our country, we look, my friends, to the humanities to prompt our deep self-reflection and thought, to help us try to make sense of this world. Indeed, it's the humanities that helps us understand the human condition and forms the foundation of social justice and equality. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Once again, thank you to Dr. Jones, and I look forward to the lecture along with all of you. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you, Provost DeHaze. Now, I would like to invite Professor Ray Ferguson from URI's History Department to introduce our speaker this evening. Professor Ferguson.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here tonight to introduce such a distinguished scholar of our American story. Big URI welcome to you, Dr. Martha Jones, and thank you for joining our program tonight as keynote speaker. In Dr. Jones' own words, she is, quote, a historian, writer, and commentator who focuses on how Black Americans have shaped the history of American democracy. This theme, she writes, runs through my scholarship, commentary, and creative projects. Tonight, Dr. Jones talks to us about her new book, Vanguard, How Black Women Overcame Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. Her previous book, Birthright Citizens, was published in 2018 and told, her words, a history of citizenship in decades before the Civil War, and examines how Black Americans claimed their place as birthright citizens and constructed their legal rights against a worldview that said they were not citizens and that they had no rights. In 2015, Dr. Jones also co-edited a book, Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women. Yes, Black women have an intellectual tradition. Dr. Jones' first book, published in 2007, All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, looked at African American debates about women's rights at a time when most Black people themselves could not vote. Dr. Jones wrote that book, quote, was inspired by the women she'd met as a girl at Bennett College. That thing about being inspired by the Black women around you is something Dr. Jones holds in common with so many of the scholars and writers who built the field of Black women's history, as they researched and wrote at the same time as they identified and collected the documents that today fill historical archives across the country. Scholars and writers who themselves were inspired by their mothers, grandmothers, and aunties. You had me hooked, Dr. Jones, in that first chapter where you wrote of the women of your own family being your inspiration for this book. I was particularly tickled to hear about your relationship to Fannie Williams. That name made me flash back to the basement of the Indianapolis Public Library as a graduate student, looking at a list of Berea students on microfilm from the Indianapolis Freeman, back before they put it in state archives and the cleaner places to look at this stuff. About those pre-academic years of her life, when she was being inspired by family lore and the women around her, Dr. Jones also wrote, I was born in central Harlem, where my first playground was at the Riverton, the Black alternative to New York City's Stuyvesant Town, 135th Street, y'all. By the time I was school age, we had moved to suburban Long Island, where my family integrated a previously all-white enclave. For my students, Blockbusters. My girlhood summers included stays with my paternal grandmother at her home on Bennett College's campus in Greensboro, North Carolina. My early education prepared me for work as an activist scholar, an activist lawyer, again for my students in the tradition of W.E.B. Du Bois. I received a BA from Hunter College in 1983, where I joined a diverse student body, worked alongside stellar researchers as a psychology major, and discovered my passion for social justice with the city as my classroom. I earned my JD in 1987 from the CUNY School of Law, that's City University of New York, y'all, where our motto was law in the service of human needs. Among my teachers was Patricia Williams, whose work still influences me today. CUNY Law launched my career, she wrote, as a public interest lawyer. I worked out of community-based law offices for nearly 10 years, representing homeless people, people with mental illness, and women living with HIV and AIDS. In 1994, she continued, I was awarded a Charles A. Rafson Fellowship on the future of the city of New York at Columbia University for my lawyering work. The direction of my career took a sharp but welcome turn. I was drawn to research and writing by Eric Foner and the late Manning Marable, whose own careers linked scholarship and social justice. I discovered my inner archive rat, learned the politics of history, and stayed at Columbia to earn a PhD in 2001 in history. I spent the next 16 years teaching history, law, and African American studies at the University of Michigan, where I was a presidential bicentennial professor. Dr. Jones has many, many professional kudos, which include currently being the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. Over the course of her years, she's received broad support and recognition for her work from the American Council of Learned Societies and the Organization of American Historians, the American Society for Legal History, and the National Humanities Center, where she was the William C. and Ida Friday Fellow. Dr. Jones has also held fellowships from the Columbia University Center for the Critical Analysis of Social Difference, the University of Pennsylvania Law School, the National Constitution Center, the American Historical Association, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. In 2010, Dr. Jones was selected as a distinguished lecturer with the Organization of American Historians. She has been elected member of the Society of American Historians and a fellow of the American Antiquarian Society. In 2019, Dr. Jones was awarded a Doctors of Law, honoris causa, from her alma mater, CUNY School of Law. The History Department, you think that would be enough, right? The History Department at the Johns Hopkins University points out on its webpage that Dr. Jones is also, quote, a public historian, frequently writing for broader audiences at the Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Time. The curatorship of museum exhibitions, including Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation, in conjunction with the William L. Clements Library, and museum, film, and video productions with Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, PBS, the American Experience, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Netflix, and Art France. Dr. Jones is not only a distinguished scholar, but also, I think, pretty cool. But maybe it's just because I'm old. She even knows about the other Martha Jones, the character from Doctor Who, the companion who saved the good doctor from the master and then left because she was in love with him and wasn't properly returned, and she wasn't going to follow him around. True feminist. Well, this was fun. I can't wait for the lecture. I know we're in virtual space, but please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Martha S. Jones. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferguson. I'm really grateful for that generous and warm introduction. Thanks to everyone at the University of Rhode Island, including Provost Donald DeHaze, Professor Katie McIntyre. It's my honor to be with you this evening and to be part of your honoring of Eleanor Carlson with this lecture. Thank you so much. My theme this evening is the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. And we are here in 2020 marking the centennial of that landmark moment in US women's history. My work is to do less celebrating and more myth busting, if you will. We'll spend some time tonight looking closely at the amendment, what it did and did not do. And my hope is that through the opportunity to better understand what happened in 1920, we are in some sense better equipped to move forward in our own time. Now, mention to me that you're celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, and you might observe that I slightly cringe. Don't get me wrong, I've just finished a book about the history of Black women in the vote, and so I'm as interested as anyone in this anniversary and its significance. And still, I can't quite bring a spirit of celebration to the occasion. It might just get in the way of the story I have to tell. When we appreciate what an open secret Black women's disenfranchisement was in 1920, the facts of the 19th Amendment fit only awkwardly with events that feature light shows, period costumes, and marching bands. In 1920, members of Congress who promulgated the 19th Amendment, state lawmakers who ratified it, and suffragists themselves all understood that nothing in its terms prohibited states from strategically using poll taxes, literacy tests, and understanding clauses to keep Black women from registering to vote. Nothing in the new amendment promised to curb the intimidation and violence that threatened Black women who came out to polling places. Voting rights and voter suppression went hand in hand in 1920. Now, I'm a historian, and fortunately for all of us, I think, nothing in my job requires me to plan commemorative festivities. Instead, my work is to cut through half-truths and myths about the past and equip us with the critical tools needed to think about the future of our democracy. 25 years ago, historian Michel Rolfe-Triot looked back on the celebration that marked 500 years since 1492, the year in which Christopher Columbus was for a long time said to have discovered the Americas. Professor Triot warned historians away from such occasions. He worried that we would be drawn into promoting sanitized partial truths and even myths that the occasions demanded. The difficult history of European contact and conquest with the indigenous people of the Americas, including that of Columbus, was muted and even omitted altogether in efforts to cast the anniversary year as a celebration. Such framings may have filled the coffers of tourist venues and souvenir sellers, but they did too little to promote critical understanding of how colonialism devastated the people and the lands of the hemisphere. So when asked why I've stayed home from the celebrations, I'll note that the centennial of the 19th Amendment marks a milestone in the American story of voting rights. I add that remembering that era of voter suppression may indeed help us to see more clearly how ballots are being withheld today. It may even encourage us to recommit to the ongoing work of ensuring voting rights for all Americans. And I'm eager to contribute the stories of Black women to our collective understanding of the 19th Amendment. But as a nation, we're not yet ready for that grand celebration. The promise of voting rights for all still remains on the horizon. Let's go back to August in 1920 and look at what precisely happened then. I think that moment is, even today, still shrouded in two principal myths. The first is one that goes something like, when the 19th Amendment became law, all women won the vote. Or even with the 19th Amendment, American women were guaranteed the vote. And there's a second myth, one that runs, in a sense, contrary to the first. That goes something like, no Black American women gained the vote in 1920, that racism kept Black women from the polls. So in this anniversary year, my work has been to replace some of those myths with history. So let's take a look at the text of the 19th Amendment as we begin. August 1920, the requisite 36 states ratified the amendment, and it becomes part of the Constitution. These are the precise words. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So what precisely did that mean for American women? Now, laws that reserved the ballot for men violated the Constitution. And still, the 19th Amendment did not promise women the vote. Still, state laws, kept women from the polls based upon age, citizenship, residency, mental competence, and in 1920, it was still the case that American women who married non-US citizens were denaturalized. They lost their citizenship and hence their right to vote. So that fall, the women who showed up to register confronted many sorts of hurdles, even if sex was not one of them. Now, one additional barrier to women's votes persisted even after a federal amendment, and that was racism. It was true that the 15th Amendment in 1870 had expressly forbid states from denying the vote based upon race. But by 1920, lawmakers in the South, and to some extent in the West, had set in place hurdles that, while silent about race, had the net effect of disenfranchising Black Americans. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses had effectively kept many Black men from casting their ballots since the 1890s. Unchecked intimidation and the threat of lynching sealed the deal. Local voting officials effectively constructed a color line, though they rarely ever invoked race. So did American women win the vote in 1920? Not all women. African American women in too many states became mere equals of their fathers and husbands. State laws now disenfranchise them in an end run around the spirits of the 15th and the 19th Amendments. Registration numbers in 1920 reflected the effects of these discriminatory laws. And that fall, Black women presented themselves to voting officials, but too many found the books closed. And at the same time, the first waves of Black women voters had been unleashed years before the 19th Amendment was ratified, as individual states made women's suffrage the law. In California starting in 1911, Illinois in 1913, and New York in 1917, Black women were already experienced voters by 1920. Even more managed to cast their ballots after registering that fall in the wake of the 19th Amendment. How did Black women manage to do that? One example comes from the city of St. Louis in Missouri, where Black women there organized under the auspices of the Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YWCA. There, Black women ran a suffrage school where they prepared one another to confront hostile registrars and ultimately to cast their ballots. They taught one another how to pay a poll tax, how to pass a literacy test. They read the Constitution together so that they'd be prepared when a reluctant registrar insisted that they explain something like the Electoral College. Black women turned out, and the newspapers reported that nearly every woman in the city registered that season, Black and white. Now, for Black women in St. Louis, registering and casting ballots was more than a mere fulfillment of the promise of the 19th Amendment. It was more than a symbol of American women's expanding political power. For Black women in St. Louis, getting to the polls was a matter of civil rights. As recently as 1916, the city of St. Louis had begun to use ballot initiatives to set in place a segregation regime that was dividing the city and its residents along the color line. And African American women knew that Black men in that year had been harassed They had been arrested on non-existent charges, and many of them had never been able to cast ballots. They understood that if they were to vote, it would require a great deal of planning and a great deal of organization. But by October of 1920, Black women made up more than 10, probably closer to 20% of the city's more than 110,000 new women voters. Black women in St. Louis believed that strength at the ballot box might help stem the tide of segregation in the city of St. Louis. Their experience contrasts sharply to that of women in the city of Daytona, Florida, where throughout 1920, educator and National Association of Colored Women's Clubs leader Mary Mcleod Bethune had been traveling the state to encourage Black women to register in the spirit of those suffrage schools in St. Louis. But in Florida, Mrs. Bethune was confronted by a brutal, terroristic regime, violence, intimidation, harassment, and more. She, along with all Black voting rights advocates in Florida, faced tremendous risk as they organized to cast ballots in the fall of 1920. Mrs. Bethune and her school in Daytona were visited on the eve of Election Day 1920 by men of the Ku Klux Klan who assembled in downtown Daytona on horseback in full regalia, having burnt a cross in the river. And then this parade of terrorists marched onto the grounds of Mrs. Bethune's school, industrial school for African American girls in Daytona, today's Bethune-Cookman University. Their purpose, of course, was to intimidate Mrs. Bethune, her faculty, and all of the Black prospective voters in the city of Daytona. They were not deterred in 1920, and instead, the next morning, the Black women of Daytona gathered together, turned out to the polls as a group in an effort to resist and deflect intimidation and violence. And this work would continue on through the next years. Again, on election eve in 1922, the Klan would visit Mrs. Bethune's school, again in an effort to intimidate Black voters. And by that election season, many Black voting rights advocates in Florida stepped away from the front lines. That work had become far too dangerous for them to persist. Mrs. Bethune, as we'll return to in a few minutes, will go on to an important career that in essence did end run around disfranchisement in Florida. But there was no question, but in the 1920s, voting rights would not be the way in which Florida's Black women would gain political power. So what are Black women to do when they look out across the country in 1920 after the fall election season and recognize what an uneven experience they have had collectively? One of the answers comes through the work of the National Association of Colored Women. Here, an organization founded in the 1890s, yes, to pursue Black women's political rights, but also, to pursue federal anti-lynching legislation and more. The president of the National Association of Colored Women in 1920 was Hallie Quinn Brown. Like Bethune, an educator, a trained elocutionist who had studied at the Chautauqua Institution, someone who had cut her political teeth in her church community, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and by the early 20th century had led the NACW's suffrage department. By 1920, Hallie Quinn Brown was president of the National Association of Colored Women, some 300,000 women strong, charged with now, in essence, building a new movement for voting rights in the wake of the disappointments of the 19th Amendment. Hallie Quinn Brown and her team set their sights on winning federal legislation. Their view is that now the 19th Amendment empowers Congress to pass new laws that will guarantee to women the right to vote and override the Jim Crow laws that are keeping Black women from the polls, even after a federal amendment. As they begin this campaign, Black women propose that they be aided or joined by white suffragists who are just fresh from the victory of the 19th Amendment. Hallie Quinn Brown writes directly to Alice Paul, the head of the National Women's Party, to invite Paul to join her and the NACW women in lobbying for federal legislation. Alice Paul declines. She will begin folding up the National Women's Party altogether, and by 1923 will embark on a new campaign for a federal equal rights amendment, an amendment that is still making its way perhaps to ratification today. But Black women are left alone, are left behind in this moment as they contemplate the future of their voting rights. The movement that they build lasts for 45 years, taking Black women all the way to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And there are three critical prongs to that movement. The first is the ground game of American politics. In each election cycle, African American women continue to do the nitty-gritty work of registering, attempting to cast ballots, and more. Perhaps the best examples of the work in the 1920s comes from the example of Chicago, where Black women not only register and vote, they become important operatives within the Republican Party there, and they will use their political power, their power at the polls, to shape the outcomes of elections at the city level and at the state level. By 1928, they will be essential to electing Oscar DePriest to Congress, the first African-American man elected to Congress since 1901. This is the ground game that animates this movement going forward out of 1920. In addition to this, there is an important legal campaign, lobbying and litigation, led largely by the NAACP, which will look to chip away at the edifice of voter suppression that has become part of Jim Crow, challenging and defeating grandfather clauses, poll taxes, whites-only primaries. This team will be critical to laying the foundation and then lobbying in Washington for what becomes the Voting Rights Act. And finally, of course, by the 1940s, we have the emergence of the modern civil rights movement and the critical voting rights work now being done both by African-American women leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, Ella Baker, Septima Clark, and more. But these women, joined by hundreds and thousands of Black women across the American South, who risk their bodies, who risk their livelihoods, and more, to force the hand of Congress, to force the hand of President Lyndon Johnson in 1965, and to finally win the Voting Rights Act. Today, the 19th Amendment continues to prohibit states from denying the vote based upon sex, just as the 15th Amendment forbids states from using race when determining voting rights. And still, many American women do not have the unqualified right to vote. Here in 2020, voter suppression techniques have taken a new form, but be it the shuttering of polling places or voter ID laws, exact match requirements, or the unwillingness, the inability of local officials to guarantee us our health and our safety in the midst of pandemic. All of this and more means that the history of the 19th Amendment must be for us in this moment more than myth, because it is deeply instructive, both for how it is that voter suppression became and has continued to be so deeply entrenched in our political culture, but also, I'd say, because it draws our attention to the African American women in our own time and the ongoing work that they do to combat voting and political inequality that persists until today. And it's important to underscore that even in a new era of voter suppression, much has changed for African American women, much that was nearly unthinkable, at least for many white Americans in 1920, has become a remarkable yet ordinary fact of our own political culture. Just a few examples. I'll point to 2017 and the African American women who in that year participate in what was Alabama's special election to the US Senate. Black women will organize, will turn out, will cast their ballots. Nearly 98% of them for the Democratic candidate, Doug Jones, putting him over the top in that very close election and flipping that Senate seat from red to blue in a Senate in which, as you all know, every vote counts. Perhaps you've already seen your ballots in this year. I just cast mine at the start of the week on Tuesday. But collectively, the story that our ballots this year tell is that nearly 130 African American women are running for Congress in 2020. This is a record-shattering number. The high bar had been set, the high mark had been set in 2016, 4 years ago, when 48 Black women ran for Congress. Black women are no longer merely firsts on the political scene. They are really situating themselves as a force, even in Washington. And none of us have missed, I don't think, the candidacy of Senator Kamala Harris, who is now running alongside Joe Biden as vice president for the Democratic Party. Maybe like me, you were watching when Senator Harris delivered her acceptance speech back in August of 2020. And among the things she did was speak about the historical women on whose shoulders, she explained, she was standing that evening as she accepted the nomination. There were 6 of them, all of them women of the vanguard, all of them of this long historic epic of 100 years that we visited this evening. Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, and the era's most impassioned and effective suffragist, someone who rooted her work in Black women's politics, but always insisted on a seat at the table when white women were steering the way forward when it came to women's votes. There was Ida B. Wells, the journalist, anti-lynching advocate, and suffragist who sets the table for Oscar DePriest's win in Chicago in 1928 out of the work of Black women, including those of Ida Wells's Alpha Suffrage Club in that city. Kamala Harris acknowledged Mary Mcleod Bethune, who we've heard a bit about. Part of what's remarkable about Mrs. Bethune is that even after being viciously disenfranchised in Florida, she doesn't sit down. In fact, she picks herself up and heads to Washington, D.C., where by the 1930s, she will help President Franklin Roosevelt found his Black cabinet. She will be a master of political patronage, bringing dozens of Black Americans, including Black women, to Washington to occupy seats of decision-making in federal agencies, to bring Black Americans increasingly out of the scourge of the Depression. In 1945, Mrs. Bethune will be in San Francisco for the founding of the United Nations, where she will link arms with women of color from across the globe to ensure that women's issues were part of the foundation, the very foundation of the new United Nations. Senator Harris invoked 2 remarkable women of the civil rights era, Diane Nash and Fannie Lou Hamer. Diane Nash, the brilliant strategist behind the scenes in Nashville during the student sit-ins, in Birmingham and with the Freedom Rider struggles, and then finally in Selma, Alabama, with that city's consequential, game-changing campaign for voting rights and that fateful march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Diane Nash worked behind the scenes to force the hand of Lyndon Johnson in Congress in 1965. Fannie Lou Hamer, who was many things, as a former sharecropper, a student nonviolent coordinating committee organizer, and someone who understood the power of the camera, both still and moving, to bring the voting rights struggles of Black Americans into the living rooms, into the homes of ordinary Americans, by way of the image. Fannie Lou Hamer led the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964, challenging, holding the Democratic Party's feet to the fire for having seated a delegation from Mississippi that had been selected without the input, without the consultation, without the assent of Black Mississippians. She will make her case on national television, and really change the game on that major stage of American politics, contributing to the pressure on lawmakers and President Johnson in the year before the Voting Rights Act becomes law. The last woman on Kamala Harris's list is Constance Baker Motley. Constance Baker Motley, a lawyer on the NAACP team that is chipping away at Jim Crow throughout the years before 1965. She will go on to hold public office in New York City and then in the New York State Legislature, and finally will be appointed a federal judge and spend the rest of her public career defending the very civil rights that she and this extraordinary generations of Black women had fought for. There are, I think, 3 lessons, and then I'll close from the story that I've shared with you tonight. The first is about the ground game. Black women, discouraged, intimidated, and more, continue to work the ground game of American politics after 1920 as they aim for full voting rights. It's essential. At the same time, Black women set a high bar and always hold it up, which is to say, while they are committed to the nitty-gritty of getting to the polls, casting ballots in any given election cycle, they also hold up distinct ideals, lofty ideals, that very few Americans concur with for much of this history. But nonetheless, they teach us to always hold up our best ideals and to insist upon them even as we do the nitty-gritty work. All the women I write about understand politics as a long game, and that's really the last lesson. Many of them will not live to see the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, but this is not a reason to be discouraged or to sit down or stay home. The women of Vanguard are committed to generations-long struggles for voting rights, and they are prepared to train, to pass on, to inspire, and otherwise press the next generations, including our own, to continue to do the work of democracy, including that of voting rights. That is where I'll leave you with the admonition that we follow in their model and do the work for our own time, but also lay the foundation for the work to come from our daughters, our granddaughters, and more. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. Again, it's been an honor to be with you this evening, and I believe I'm not mistaken that we have some questions. And so I look forward to that and to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jones, for that terrific talk. You've given us so much to think about, and you've set us up for a really good discussion. I do want to remind viewers that you can purchase Dr. Jones's book, Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All at URI's campus bookstore. If you purchase it through URI's bookstore, you will also receive an autographed book plate signed by Professor Martha Jones herself. All right, we have some student questions to start with. I believe we have a video question first.
Good evening, Dr. Jones. My name is Gene, and I am a junior studying finance at URI. I first of all want to thank you for this opportunity, and thank you very much for being here. My question is twofold. One is, knowing that it took several generations for the women's suffrage movement to finally come to fruition, I'm sure the latter generation learned a lot from the previous ones in terms of what worked and what did not work. If you had to point to one thing, what would you say that the latter generation did differently than the previous ones in order to make that movement successful? And secondly, speaking from a marketing standpoint, how was the movement funded? If you could speak a little bit about that, and what was really used as financial leverage to bring about success to the women's suffrage movement? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jean. It's a terrific questions. What was new? I think that if we look at the movement that begins in 1920, we recognize that part of what's new in the modern civil rights era, first of all, is a new philosophy. It is the philosophy of nonviolence, civil disobedience, and more. Here, Black women in the early generations, I think, understand for them the risks are too great in an era of rampantly unchecked violence for them to engage in that kind of public action. That work remains profoundly dangerous in the modern civil rights era, but it is now undergirded by a philosophical reorientation around nonviolent resistance. And it is linked to, in part, your question, because now in the modern civil rights era, and the vivid example of the student sit-ins, the Freedom Ride, and the Selma campaign, that Black Americans are going to be increasingly joined by white Americans in these scenes under the philosophy of nonviolence and in the mode of direct action. And both of these facets are new, and I think we would credit them with having pushed voting rights to the front burner in Congress and making that demand one that President Johnson cannot resist. But it is this that is also the answer, I think, in part to how this movement is financed. In part, this movement is financed very much the way that Black activism had long been financed, through membership dues in organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, the NAACP, and more. These are grassroots movements with hundreds of thousands of members who pay small but mighty dues to support their organizations. By the modern civil rights era, this will be supplemented clearly by Black women's own fundraising. It is a tradition that goes all the way back to the abolitionist movement in church basements, in fairs, and much more. Black women are doing the fundraising work in their own communities to support activists, to support action, and more. And at the same time, in the modern civil rights era, the movement gains also the support of philanthropists, of educational institutions, and more, that give it a extended financial footing, and I really appreciate the question, Jean. It's not one that anybody's ever asked me before, but it is, of course, so essential to understand the nuts and bolts. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Jean. That was a good question. And thank you, Professor Jones. Looks like we have a written question in. You can ask questions for Dr. Jones on our social media pages, College of Arts and Sciences Facebook page. Take a minute to like us as well. Looks like we have a question from Emma Hayes. She is asking, do you think movements like the Me Too movement or reproductive rights initiatives are more intersectional than past movements, or is there still a separation of women based on race?
That's a terrific question. And I think by the term intersectional, I think what Emma is asking is whether these are movements in which Black and white women are working together and in coalition. And you point, Emma, to one of the great tensions in the story we now tell about the road to the 19th Amendment and beyond, which is indeed one in which the political relationships, the alliances, and more between Black and white women are limited and oftentimes strained. That the road to the 19th Amendment was in many ways paved with an acquiescence to white supremacy, especially when it came to including Southern women, white women of the American South in the movement. And so there is, I think, a legacy that we, to an important degree, still live with today, or are learning to live beyond, perhaps, today. And I'll tell you how I am thinking about this today, Emma, and I'd be interested how other people think about it. But, you know, one of the legacies of the 19th Amendment when it came to voting behavior was that Black American women very quickly emerged as constituents who voted as a bloc, who deliberated, who organized and voted as a bloc, and used their political power as Black women collectively. And historian Liette Gidlow is writing a wonderful social history of precisely this phenomena. White American women do not come to the polls in 1920 as a bloc. They do not vote out of a sense of collective or shared women's issues. And this remains true until this moment, at least up until this moment. So I, perhaps like you, will be watching how women, American women, white American vote in 2020. Have we arrived at a moment when Black and white women collectively understand their interests in a critical election year to be shared interests such that they're bind together and use their political influence to affect the outcome in November? I am one who cannot say, but I certainly think it is a question we should be asking of our own time. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Emma. That was a great question. Looks like we have a video, another student video question up next.
Hi, Dr. Jones. My name is Emmy. I'm a freshman at URI, and I wanted to thank you for doing this lecture for us. And I was wondering about how during the women's suffragist movement, all women were fighting for the right to vote, but white women were also fighting against Black women, trying to keep them from gaining the vote. And during that time, white women were treating Black women horribly, trying to keep them from being able to vote. And I was wondering about how much of that racism came from the difference in education between the women, and if it was a byproduct of an educational discrepancy between white and Black women of the time, or was it a fear that Black women fighting for the right to vote would somehow impact the chances of white women being able to vote? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Emmy. It's a strong and really important question. I would say that by the time, and this would be in the 1890s, by the time it becomes clear that the National American Women's Suffrage Association is going to accommodate and acquiesce to anti-Black racism. Black and white women are leaders in politics, are peers in educational terms. The women that I've invoked, most of them are college-educated women, middle-class women. Mary Mcleod Bethune is the president of a girls' school. Mary Church Terrell sits on the Board of Education of the Washington, D.C. Ida B. Wells is a journalist, travels internationally lecturing on lynching. So it's to say that the leadership of organizations like the NACW these are Black women who are direct peers to their white counterparts. And at the same time, racism is sometimes a point of view that resides in the hearts and the minds of white suffragists. Racism is certainly a tactic. Mobilizing anti-Black racism becomes a tactic or strategy that white suffragists will use. And increasingly into the 20th century, organizations like the National Women's Party and NAWSA will organize themselves to accommodate what is perceived to be the unwillingness of white Southern women to work collaboratively or intimately with African American women. So oftentimes I think you'll hear people say, well, the racism in the suffrage movement was pragmatic. Perhaps it was expedient. That's another term that we hear invoked, but it was racism nonetheless. And in my view, it was a missed opportunity by white suffragists to link arms with African American women and to really transform the landscape for all American women in 1920, and not only for white American women. That, I think, was a missed opportunity.
Great. Thank you. Looks like we have another question coming in on chat. As a reminder, you can send questions on College of Arts and Sciences Facebook page. We have a question from Jen. Jen is asking, with voter suppression on the rise, what is your recommendation to motivate voters to vote?
That's a great question, Jen. Just do it. Just do it, folks. That's my message. But no, it's a serious question, because I understand you to be speaking to what we know about the American electorate writ large, which is that Americans turn out in woefully low numbers, though higher numbers in presidential election years. How can we encourage folks to vote? I think perhaps, as Provost DeHaze alluded to in his opening remarks, there is a kind of complacency. There is a sense that we have a right to vote, which in fact we don't, at least not constitutionally speaking. The sense that voting is sort of a routine and a ritual without a lot of substance. With my students, what we've been doing is interviewing elders about their experience at the polls. And, you know, there are elders among us who, yes, were voted for the first time after 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. There are those among us who are immigrant Americans who did not cast ballots until they waited perhaps many, many years to become naturalized citizens. There are in our communities formerly incarcerated people who had had their voting rights revoked and only later have come back to be able to exercise the vote. These are the stories that I think today are most moving, and are worth collecting and contemplating. Nobody is a better advocate for why we should vote than someone who has had their vote taken away. And I'll say one more thing, that among my students this semester now are those who themselves, as young first-time voters, are confronting voter suppression. This generation, I don't know how old Jen is, so I don't want to assume, right? But this generation of first-time voters are going to face voter suppression in all the forms that we have pointed to. And this, I think, is clearly what is animating the extraordinary long lines and the extraordinary turnout in states like Texas we've seen, and Georgia we've seen, North Carolina we've seen, because these are folks who have the strong sense that there are forces out there who would keep them from voting. That might not be the perfect equation, but I think we're all on notice not to take the right to vote for granted, and I hope that motivates many more of us to use it.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for that question. Again, you can keep looking at Arts and Science's Facebook page. You'll find a link to Professor Jones's book, Vanguard. You can purchase at URI's bookstore, and you can also ask a question. Looks like next we have a student video question.
Hi, Dr. Jones. My name is Katie Reardon. I'm a junior political science major here at URI, and my question is about the Women's Rights Monument that was recently put up in Central Park. So I know that in the past, in 2019, I believe, you wrote an article for the Washington Post, which I've read, that was critiquing the monument, and I know that since then they modified it, and then they put up the modified version that included Sojourner Truth. Do you feel that that was a good decision, or do you feel that that still has the same problems that you pointed out in your article, that it sort of rewrites history and whitewashes it almost in a way? Do you feel like it would have been a better decision to have made a statue just of Sojourner Truth? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you for tuning in to the debates that surrounded this monument. I can tell you, Katie, that that monument, the initial proposal, which for folks who aren't familiar with it, was a proposal that a monument would go into New York Central Park to honor early suffragists, and it was intended to include only two figures, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony. And as Katie mentioned, I wrote an op-ed that suggested that there was at least one other New Yorker who was appropriate for that monument, and that was the formerly enslaved abolitionist and women's rights advocate Sojourner Truth. And indeed, the monument, after much public commentary and revamping of the design itself, Sojourner Truth is now on the monument. That monument and that dust-up was very much the inspiration behind my writing Vanguard. That I don't, and it's a way of saying to you that I'm not someone who designs monuments. I think that is a very challenging undertaking, whether you are a team that raises the funds, or you are a public agency that reviews the proposals, or you are the artist who goes back to the drawing board more than once in response to feedback and commentary and even controversy. That is not work that I envy. Writing books are hard, but in a book I get, I don't know, roughly 100,000 words in which to express the full range of my ideas. And while I still have to do a lot of editing and pruning, what a challenge to try and express or embody the early struggles over women's rights and women's suffrage in this country in the figure of any small number of women, 2, 3, 5, 7. I've seen proposals for monuments that choose it's always an odd number, but it is a number, a finite number nonetheless. And there are always going to be debates about that. So your question was I satisfied? I was gratified that Sojourner Truth was added to the monument. I think it was absolutely suitable, 1,000% appropriate, and better reflects the diverse history of women's suffrage and the diverse community that is New York City even today. And still, if you asked me, I could name plenty more women who I think should be there and tell you why. But that's why I don't design monuments, and that's why I write books.
Great. Thank you. All right. It looks like we have another question coming in on the Arts and Sciences Facebook page. As a reminder, go to URI's Arts and Sciences Facebook page, like us, ask a question. And it looks like Julia Medina is asking, in what ways do you believe colorism had an effect on Black women's suffrage? Good question.
Thank you for that question, Julia. And by colorism, I take Julia to mean not only the fact of Black women with varied and infinitely varied skin tones, but the kind of hierarchy and prejudice that is then correlates with that rather uninteresting fact about women's skin. It is an important part, I think, of this story. On the one hand, an attention to color reminds us that the story of Black women and political rights and political power is linked to a very difficult history of slavery and of sexual violence. That many of the women in Vanguard, while not themselves enslaved, are the descendants of enslaved people, enslaved mothers, who inherit the color of their skin out of the scourge that was rape as part of enslaved women's reality before the Civil War. I think that's one thread in that story. On the other hand, there is another story about the ways in which then out of that very troubled history, social hierarchies are constructed such that women of lighter hues are enjoy a kind of political status, access, create community or alliance among and between one another. And I do think we see that reflected in the leadership of organizations like the National Association of Colored Women. I'll tell you something that I've been reflecting on, Julia, and it's not in this book because it really is a reflection that deserves a longer consideration. But one of the figures in this book, Mary Mcleod Bethune, is a dark-skinned African-American woman. And Mrs. Bethune, in my household growing up, was a hero. Someone who I had heard stories about as a girl. But when I came to do this work, I recognized that she didn't always figure as centrally as she might have. I hope I conveyed tonight what remarkably not only accomplished, but courageous and important life she lived. And I've had to wonder, if even in the writing of our histories, colorism hasn't shaped something in the figures that we foreground and those who are, if you will, left to the margins of the story. I can't really answer that question for myself quite yet, but I want to share it with you to say it's one that writing about Mrs. Bethune, who was a queen, frankly. I don't know why we haven't given her more attention. Ida Wells has more than one book-length biography. Mary Church Terrell is about to have her own book-length biography coming out this winter. Why doesn't Mary Mcleod Bethune have a biography and more. She is getting a statue in the Capitol, in the National Statuary Collection, spearheaded by lawmakers in the state of Florida. But I think it's overdue. And I do think we have to ask ourselves if that isn't in part an artifact of colorism. So thank you very much for the question.
All right, thank you. We have time for one final question, and I'm going to go to a video question as the last question.
Good evening, Dr. Jones. My name is Layla Cox. I am a junior studying communications and journalism with a minor in leadership studies. I'm involved in the Student Senate on campus as well as the Black Student Union. Thank you for being here this evening. I was wondering if you could discuss the racism within the suffrage movement, particularly focusing on the context of Black feminism versus white feminism, and then maybe offer some words of encouragement or advice to all feminists around the world in society, regardless of their race, gender, sexuality.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question, Layla. We've touched on the role of anti-Black racism in the women's suffrage movement as organized by NAWSA, the National Women's Party. I guess it's important to say that one place where I found this to be poignant is in the ways in which white American women within the movement struggled, and really I think were not able to hear some of Black women's central concerns and the issues that they wanted this movement to address. Partly that was sexual violence, past, present, and future. Black women tell the stories of the assault, intimidation, threats, and brutality that they experience as political women, as public women. And in my view, they don't get a hearing. They don't get to see that issue come fully to the table within the suffrage movement. So I think that's one way to think about the tension. But let me be more explicit. The women I write about them, so many of them tell stories about a very fraught space, and that is what for much of early America was called the ladies' car. And that was a railroad accommodation that was set aside for women and children, and contrasted dramatically in its atmosphere, in its mood, in its conditions from a smoker car where men drank and smoked and caroused and more. And Black women struggle for access to the ladies' car, both for its symbolic meaning and for its material comforts. And nearly every woman I write about has been in some kind of tussle in the ladies' car. They are derided, they are shouted at, they are manhandled, they are assaulted. And what I want to tell you about that is that what Black women then tell us is that white women watch, right? That part of the divide between Black and white women is the way in which white American women are witness to and fail to intervene as they see Black women denigrated, derided, assaulted, and worse. And this is a profound rift. So you asked for hopeful words, and I'm afraid I've just shared something with you that is difficult to move directly away from and into the hopeful. But I do want to say that I think we live today in a moment where both things are true, right? Which is to say that as we decry, we protest, and we mourn the killing of a young woman like Breonna Taylor, we are also in a moment where we can hold up, engage, and perhaps even celebrate the candidacy of Kamala Harris. What a complicated equation for all Americans, including Black women, to grapple with in 2020. Is that hopeful? Perhaps, but I think it is the necessary dilemma, and that we have to grapple with all of that in our own lifetimes rather than reduce ourselves or our politics to one or the other side of the equation. So thanks so much, Layla, for the question.
All right, that concludes our time for questions tonight. There were some terrific questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but perhaps I'll put Professor Jones in contact with a few of you. I'm so impressed by student questions. Nice job, everybody. Thank you again, Professor Jones. That was a terrific lecture and a great Q&A session. I think you've inspired us. You've given us a lot to think about, but I think you've inspired us to get out the vote. This is great. And I would like to remind people, if you want to learn more about the history of Black women's suffrage, you can purchase a copy of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All at URI's bookstore. And I also would like to invite everybody to come back virtually in 2 weeks for the next installment of the Long Road to the Vote Suffrage Centennial Lecture Series. In 2 weeks, on Thursday, October 29th at 7 p.m., we have Professor Hillary Levy-Friedman from Brown University. She is going to give a talk entitled Suffrage and Sashes, American Pageantry and the Feminist Movement. Again, that's October 29th at 7 p.m. Check out our website so you can learn how to register for it. Again, thank you again to our speaker, Professor Jones. Thank you to the audience for such wonderful questions, and we'll see you all again soon. Take care.